Hello and welcome to Soulspeak. Tonight, we step back to 1912 to a night so quiet, even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. On the morning of June 10, 1912, a small Midwestern town awoke to a scene the country would not soon forget. In a modest white house on East 2nd Street in Villisca, Iowa, 8 people lay dead in their beds: Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, and 2 young guests who had stayed over after a church service. The brutal, intimate nature of the killings, bodies bludgeoned in their sleep with the blunt side of an axe, turned a private home into a public. Horror and set a nation talking about an enemy that could walk unseen among them. The facts are stark and grim. The Moore house showed no sign of forced entry. Whatever or whoever entered had done so with a patience that suggested planning. 2 cigarette butts were later found in the attic. A lamp had been dimmed and its chimney removed. Mirrors and windows were covered, and the victims' faces were shrouded. An axe later identified as belonging to the family was found in the guest room, beside a slab of bacon wrapped in a towel and a stray keychain that did not belong to the Moores. Those odd specific details made the scene feel less like a simple burglary gone wrong and more like the deliberate act of someone who knew what they were doing. For more than a century, investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths have tried to stitch those details into a coherent picture. Motive, opportunity, and a trail long since grown cold. Suspects were rounded up, confessions were made and retracted, and at least one man stood trial twice, only to have juries deadlock or return not guilty verdicts. Evidence was compromised early on. Curious townspeople trampled through the home before modern forensic methods could be brought to bear. So the question remains, as it has for generations, but who could have done it, and why? In the hours ahead, we will walk through the timeline of that night, examine the crime scene and its oddities, and sift through the suspects and theories that rose from the ashes of Villisca. The answers, if they exist, are buried in the details. Villisca was the kind of town that kept its own calendar in the faces of its people. With a population barely over 2,000, strangers were noticed, gossip moved quickly, and Sundays belonged to the Presbyterian Church. Streets were unpaved, porches were common, and lamps oil or carbide threw a soft, uneven light into rooms that later generations would call cozy. In that rhythm of routine, the Moore family fit like a steady stitch, ordinary, respectable, and utterly familiar to their neighbors. Josiah Moore ran a modest farm equipment business and carried himself with the pragmatic air of a man used to honest labor. Sarah was a devoted churchgoer and mother, known for charity and quiet competence. Their 4 children, Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur Boyd, and little Paul Vernon, moved through the town with the ease of children who had never needed to be watched too closely. They played in yards, fetched errands, and learned hymns at the same pews their parents sat in. The Stillinger sisters, Ina and Lena, were part of the same small orbit, friends of the family who had come from a neighboring household to attend the Children's Day service and, by custom, asked to stay over. Life in Villisca was ritualized around predictable markers: work at dawn, the church bell on Sunday, supper with neighbors, and the casual trust that came with living in a place where everyone's name was known. Doors were rarely bolted, and tools lay where they were used. An axe in a yard was as ordinary as a broom on a porch. That normalcy is important to note because it explains how a stranger could plausibly enter a home without immediate alarm, and how a weapon of opportunity might be taken and used. The setting was not one of isolation so much as of assumed safety. On the afternoon and evening of June 9, 1912, the rhythms of Villisca continued unremarkably. The Moore family attended the Children's Day service at their church, the building filled with neighbors and small talk about crops and weather. After the program, children lingered for cookies and conversation. The Moores walked home together sometime around 9:30 or a little later, a small procession through familiar lanes under a damp, cool sky. They shared milk and biscuits, exchanged the kind of light laughter that had become nearly a background hum in their lives, then turned in for the night. That ordinary sequence: church, supper, bedtime is what makes the violence that followed so disorienting. There was no sign, from the neighborhood's perspective, of escalating danger or private conflict. No police calls, no reported threats, no dramatic quarrels to mark a motive visible to the town. This absence of public disturbance left investigators with a stark problem. Motive and means were not obvious because from the outside, the Moores had done nothing to draw exceptional attention to themselves. The last normal hours of the Moore household therefore carry an uncanny weight. In a town where lives were transparent and interwoven, the family's unremarkable evening emphasized how thoroughly their routine could be exploited. That night would be their last together. not because anyone expected an ending, but because the ordinary trust of a small Midwestern town provided the context in which extraordinary violence could be carried out and, for a long time, left unexplained. The evening of June 9, 1912, began as peacefully as any other Sunday in Villisca. After attending the Children's Day service at their Presbyterian church, Josiah and Sarah Moore walked home with their 4 children and the Stillinger sisters, Ina and Lena, who had asked to stay overnight. The air was cool and damp, the kind that softened footsteps on the dirt road. They chatted with neighbors, exchanged good nights, and disappeared into their white 2-story home on East 2nd Street. Inside, the faint smell of lamp oil mingled with the sweetness of cookies cooling on the table. The routine was simple and familiar: milk for the children, light conversation between the parents, doors left unlocked because there was no reason to fear anything beyond the dark. Sometime before midnight, that assumption of safety began to crumble, though no one in the house could have known it. Evidence later suggested that someone had already entered through the back door, possibly while the family was still at church, and had climbed into the narrow attic above the bedrooms. 2 cigarette butts found there would become one of the most chilling clues in the investigation. Whoever waited in that cramped space had remained still for hours, breathing quietly while the Moores moved below, talking, reading, tucking in the children. It was not a spontaneous act. It was patience, planned and controlled. When the house finally fell silent, the killer descended. He took an oil lamp from a dresser, removed its glass chimney, and bent the wick so the flame would burn low and steady. Only a faint glow spilled across the wooden floors, enough to see shapes, but not enough to wake anyone. In that dim light, he picked up Josiah Moore's axe, which had been left as usual in the backyard, and began to move through the rooms with the precision of someone who already knew the layout. The first attack came in the master bedroom. Josiah and Sarah slept side by side, unaware of the shadow standing near their bed. The first blow crushed Josiah's skull so violently that the axe struck the ceiling above, leaving a gouge that investigators would later measure. Sarah was struck next, and then struck again multiple times, the weapon rising and falling until the killer seemed satisfied that neither would stir again. After the parents, the killer turned toward the children's room. One by one, Herman, Mary, Catherine, Arthur, and Paul were silenced. The coroner noted that most blows came from the blunt end of the axe, not the blade, a calculated choice. Using the pole prevented the weapon from getting lodged in bone and allowed for faster, more repeated strikes. The decision spoke of experience. Whoever wielded the axe had done this before, or understood how to kill efficiently. Downstairs, in the guest room, Ina and Lena Stillinger slept in a borrowed bed. The same axe was used on them, but signs suggested that 12-year-old Lena had awakened. A defensive wound marked her arm, and her body was found twisted slightly out of position, one leg exposed as if she had tried to flee or fight back. Early rumors claimed sexual assault, but doctors later ruled that out. The reality was grim enough without embellishment. She had simply been awake when death reached her. When the slaughter ended, the house was eerily tidy. Every mirror and reflective surface had been covered with clothing or towels. Sheets were pulled over the victims' faces. The murderer took time to clean up, wiping his hands in a bowl of water, even helping himself to leftover food from the kitchen. Near the axe, police later found a slab of bacon taken from the icebox and wrapped in a towel, alongside a keychain that did not belong to the family. Whether those objects meant anything is still unknown, but their placement suggested ritual rather than accident. Before leaving, the killer returned to the upstairs rooms and struck Josiah and Sarah again, as if to erase them entirely. A shoe near the bed filled with blood during this second assault. Then, as dawn began to lighten the fields outside, he slipped out, locking the door behind him. There were no footprints leading away from the house, no neighbors who heard a cry. In that quiet town, the night passed without alarm. By sunrise, the house on East 2nd Street looked untouched, shutters drawn, curtains still. But inside, 8 lives had been taken with deliberate, silent efficiency. The crime's orderliness was more terrifying than chaos would have been. Whoever killed the Moores had shown control, strength, and an almost clinical understanding of violence. He had waited, struck, cleaned, and vanished. When the neighbor, Mary Peckham, knocked on the door a few hours later, she had no idea that the killer had likely been gone for hours, moving calmly down a country road while Villisca still slept in innocence. Dawn brought an ordinary Villisca morning, pale light over porches and the distant clatter of farm life, until Mary Peckham noticed that the Moore house did not answer the town's usual rhythm. Doors in that neighborhood were rarely bolted. Lights came on early. Children's footsteps were expected. On the morning of June 10th, she found the house dark and strangely silent. A neighborly concern hardened into alarm when knocks went unanswered and a copied key failed to rouse anyone inside. Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, arrived shortly afterward. He tried the door, called into the rooms, and when there was still no reply, he used his duplicate key to enter. What he saw stopped time for everyone who would later hear the story. 2 figures under a sheet in the guest room, faces hidden as if someone had smothered not just their bodies, but the recognition of who they had been. Ross ran for the sheriff. In the small hours that followed, Villisca's few officers, including Henry Hank, Horton, and a handful of townsmen, moved through the house in disbelief. The scene was horrifying in its order rather than in spectacle. Blood did not sprawl indiscriminately. The bodies lay where they had been struck, faces covered, windows and mirrors draped with cloth. A lamp without its chimney lay tipped nearby. An axe sat beside a slab of bacon wrapped in a towel. Those details read like a stranger's deliberate script, and the town's initial shock quickly fractured into frantic curiosity. Despite warnings from the police, dozens then scores of townspeople filed through the rooms, drawn by a mixture of grief, fear, and morbid curiosity. Each footstep, each touch, erased traces that might have told investigators, who had come and gone the night before. Law enforcement worked under handicaps familiar to investigators of the era: rudimentary forensics, no established protocol for preserving a crime scene, and an atmosphere in which rumor moved faster than evidence. Coroners and doctors examined the bodies and estimated the time of death, but the scene had already been compromised. The attic, later found to contain 2 cigarette butts, had been disturbed. A keychain and other odd items were catalogued, but their provenance became harder to verify as more visitors handled them. As the day unfolded, Villisca's questions multiplied. Who had the combination of motive and opportunity? Had the killer been a local with grudges, or a stranger passing through on the railroad? The immediate aftermath supplied few answers and many suspicions, a dangerous mix in a town where everyone knew everyone else. The discovery that morning had opened a wound far deeper than any one family could bear. It had shattered the community's faith in the ordinary safety of daily life. The Moore house was less a chaotic crime scene than a staged one. That distinction is the first thing investigators and later analysts returned to again and again. Mirrors and windows were deliberately covered with sheets and clothing. The victims' faces were shrouded. A lamp had its chimney removed and the wick bent low. At first glance, these acts read like small, irrational gestures, but taken together they form a pattern that suggests intention beyond simple killing. One of the strangest physical oddities was the slab of bacon found beside the axe, wrapped in a towel, and a bowl of bloody water left near the scene. Those items do not point to robbery or a hurried, panicked assailant. Instead, they imply a killer who paused, arranged, and even touched the place where violence had occurred. The absence of identifiable fingerprints, combined with the presence of 2 cigarette butts in the attic, reinforced the idea that the perpetrator was careful about leaving direct traces, but not above lingering to smoke or to perform small rituals. In short, this was not a smash, it was a controlled, lingering event. The forensic detail that the blunt pole, the back of the axe, was used for most strikes is revealing. Using the pole is efficient. It reduces the chance of a blade sticking in bone, allows for quicker repeated blows, and is the choice of someone who either knew how to kill effectively or had practiced the act. The gouge marks in the master bedroom ceiling and the focused wounds on multiple victims suggest force and familiarity with the weapon. Those are not the signs of a single, panicked outburst of rage. They are the marks of competence. From a behavioral perspective, the scene carries ritualistic overtones. Covering mirrors and faces can signal a desire to remove reflective witnesses or to symbolically prevent the dead from seeing their deaths. The careful dimming of the lamp and the methodical way the killer moved through rooms indicate planning. Some contemporaries speculated about religious mania, an individual convinced of a divine command, because of odd confessions and letters that circulated after the murders. Others proposed sexual or sadistic motivation, though medical examiners found little to support a sexual component. The multiplicity of possible interpretations is itself telling. The crime spoke in symbols that could be read many ways. Experts at the time were limited by early 20th century forensics, but their instincts are instructive. Local coroners remarked on the surgical efficiency of several blows and the unusual staging. Law enforcement officers described the perpetrator as experienced and calm. Those contemporary judgments have carried forward in later profiles. The likely offender was organized, patient, and practiced. Investigators of the era also noted physical limitations that ruled certain suspects out. For example, a man of slight build whose confession later seemed inconsistent with the force required. Taken together, the crime scene elements covered glass, the bacon and towel, bloody water, absence of prints, cigarette butts, and the choice of weapon technique sketch a perpetrator who blended planning with a need to impose meaning on the aftermath. Whether that meaning was ritual, signature, or simply the warped logic of a practiced killer remains disputed. What is not disputed is that the killer treated the Moore house as a stage. The violence was the act, and the scene that remained was a message intended to be read, however cryptic, by those who came after. Don's discovery quickly dissolved into confusion. Within hours of the Moore house being opened, more than 100 townspeople had passed through its rooms, drawn by grief, curiosity, and a need to see what had happened to neighbors they thought they knew. Those well-meaning intrusions destroyed fragile traces, footprints tracked through soft floors, hands that moved objects, and the mixing of residues that might once have tied a person to the scene. By the time official investigators arrived in force, the house had been altered beyond the point where careful reconstruction could restore every detail. Law enforcement in Villisca, 1912 operated with the tools and training of its time, limited scientific methods, no fingerprint database to query, and no standardized protocols for preserving a crime scene. Sheriff Henry Horton and the men who responded did what they could. They catalogued odd items, took testimony, and called in county officials. Yet even basic procedures that modern audiences take for granted were absent. The attic where the 2 cigarette butts were later found had already been disturbed. Evidence that might have linked a suspect to the household vanished under a tide of anxious onlookers and improvised handling. Rumor filled the vacuum left by compromised evidence. In a town where reputation was currency, whispers hardened into accusations. Gossip named hobos and drifters spotted near town, recalled arguments in saloons, and spun old grudges into motive. Newspapers amplified suspicion into spectacle. Telegraph wires carried lurid versions of the story to cities far beyond. Iowa fear infected daily life. Children were kept closer to home. Doors that had been left unlocked were bolted, and neighbors regarded one another with a new, wary attention. The social fabric of Villisca frayed while investigators chased leads. Those leads were many and messy. Early suspects ranged from local rivals to itinerant workers, and even to a traveling preacher who had been in town the same day. Each person brought a different possible motive: business disputes, sexual deviance, psychosis, or the aimless cruelty of a transient killer. Investigators grappled with conflicting testimony, alibis that were hard to verify, and the ever-shifting landscape of public opinion. The chaotic scene handling and the rush of speculation made it difficult to separate plausible leads from rumor. In short order, a formal list of suspects emerged, but the list was as much a reflection of community fear as it was of hard evidence. The combination of a contaminated crime scene, rudimentary investigative tools, and a town eager to find someone to blame meant that Villisca's quest for justice started handicapped, and would remain so for decades to come. Below are the 4 principal suspects examined in the original investigation and subsequent Each section lays out who the person was, why suspicion fell on them, and what ultimately weakened the case against them. 1. Frank Jones, the business rival. Frank Jones was a prominent local businessman and state senator whose name surfaced early in gossip and local suspicion. The reported friction between Jones and Josiah Moore dated to a professional split. Josiah had once worked for Jones before striking out on his own selling farm equipment. In a small town where business relationships were public and reputations mattered, that separation produced rumors of bitterness. More salacious gossip suggested a personal motive, an alleged affair between Josiah and a member of Jones's extended family, which, when combined with the business rivalry, made Jones an easy figure for angry neighbors to suspect. The arguments against Jones, however, were largely circumstantial and rumor-driven. No witness placed him near the Moore home that night, and investigators never produced physical evidence linking him to the weapon or the scene. The theory that he had the motive and the means to hire a third party, a hitman paid to erase the Moores, relied on conjecture about his temperament and influence rather than documented transactions or credible testimonies. Political enemies and town gossip can create powerful narratives, but they are weak currency in a courtroom. In short, Jones's profile fit a common-sense motive for animosity, but motive alone could not withstand scrutiny. Without corroborating physical evidence, reliable eyewitness testimony, or financial paper trails tying him to a perpetrator. Jones moved from prime suspect in public conversation to a figure of suspicion that never matured into a prosecutable case. Point 2. Reverend George Kelly, the troubled preacher. Reverend George Kelly was the most dramatic and legally consequential suspect. A traveling preacher in his 30s, Kelly had been in Villisca for the Children's Day services the evening of June 9th, and was seen interacting with the congregation. Descriptions of his character in contemporary reports painted him as eccentric and unstable. Rumors of voyeuristic behavior, inappropriate requests to young girls, and a history of odd, attention-seeking actions followed him. Kelly's behavior after the murders drew particular attention. He allegedly told fellow passengers on an early morning train about 8 people butchered in Villisca before the bodies were publicly discovered, and he later wrote letters and even sent what was described as a bloody shirt to a dry cleaner. Those actions looked grotesquely performative. Under intense scrutiny, Kelly eventually confessed to the killings, claiming divine compulsion and saying God had told him to suffer the children to come unto me. That confession, however, quickly unraveled. Kelly recanted at trial, claiming his admission was coerced, and the physical evidence undermined his capability. Contemporary coroners and defense witnesses pointed out that Kelly was slight of build and only about 5'2" and 119 pounds. That made it unlikely he could have delivered the brutal force observed on some victims, notably Josiah Moore. The prosecution's case relied heavily on his confession and on his odd behavior, but confessions obtained during that era were often unreliable, and juries tended to weigh physical feasibility and corroboration. The first trial ended with a hung jury. A second trial resulted in acquittal. Kelly's theatrical eccentricities and his later retractions created a narrative the public found compelling, but the legal standard of proof required more than suspicion and spectacle. Investigators criticized law enforcement for inconsistent handling of Kelly's statements and for the overall contamination of the crime scene, which made it difficult to link him concretely to the act. Psychologically, Kelly fit some behavioral expectations of a disturbed offender who would seek attention, but the combination of physical limitations, the recanted confession, and procedural uncertainties left his alleged guilt unproven in a court of law. Henry Lee Moore, the axeman Henry Lee Moore, emerged in the conversation because of the chilling similarity in method. He was later convicted for killing his mother and grandmother with an axe, and his crimes raised the possibility of a roaming axeman operating across state lines. Investigators and later researchers noted that several early 1900s murders across the Midwest shared commonalities with Villisca: families bludgeoned in their homes, mirrors and windows covered, and oil lamps tampered with. Those parallels fed the hypothesis that a transient killer, perhaps following rail lines, moved from town to town. Henry Lee Moore's conviction for familial axe murders demonstrated capability and a willingness to use similar means. However, connecting him to Villisca required more than shared mo. There was no direct forensic link tying him to the Moore family home, and his known crimes had a different interpersonal context: family members rather than unrelated neighbors. Investigators also struggled with timelines and travel records that could place him near Villisca. While pattern analysis is a useful investigative tool, it is also vulnerable to overreach. Similar methods can arise independently, and sensational cases encourage pattern seeking that sometimes outpaces evidence. Consequently, Henry Lee Moore remained a plausible candidate in the broader theory of an itinerant axeman, but plausibility did not equal proof. He fit the profile of a violent man with access to an axe and a history of extreme violence, yet the lack of direct connection to the Villisca scene kept him from being a definitive answer. For William Blackie Mansfield, the professional William Blackie Mansfield appears in some investigative threads as the sort of hired hand or professional who might be capable of carrying out a contract killing. Detective James Newton Wilkerson at one point suspected Mansfield, and rumors circulated that political influence, possibly from figures like Frank Jones, could have shielded him. Mansfield's name gained traction because a professional killer could plausibly explain the control, staging, and apparent lack of clumsy traces left at the scene. The weakness in the Mansfield theory lies in the evidentiary record. Payroll and employment records offered him an alibi for parts of the timeline, and like Jones, there was no smoking gun evidence, financial transfers, corroborated sightings, or physical evidence linking him to Villisca. Accusations of political interference made for compelling narrative but did not supply the sort of documentation required to sustain prosecution. Thus Mansfield remained a shadow in the case file. a figure whose profile matched certain practical aspects of the crime's skill, mobility, but who could not be tied to the scene in a way that satisfied legal standards. His suspected role highlights an enduring problem in the Villisca case: many plausible suspects, but too little admissible proof to name a guilty party. Each of these suspects carried a mix of motive, opportunity, and circumstantial indicators, yet none could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The combination of a compromised scene, rudimentary forensics, and an avalanche of rumor meant the case produced leads but few convictions, leaving Villisca's questions largely unanswered and the town's scars painfully intact. Across the Midwest in the early 1910s, a troubling pattern began to emerge in investigators' notebooks. Houses entered at night, entire families bludgeoned while they slept, mirrors and windows covered, lamps tampered with, and an axe or the blunt end of an axe used as the instrument of death. Cases in Colorado Springs, Paola, Kansas, Ellsworth, Kansas, and others shared enough ritualized detail that some detectives and later researchers saw more than coincidence. These similarities are the foundation of the serial killer hypothesis, that an itinerant offender moved along rail lines, entered houses where doors were commonly left unlocked, used whatever axe was on hand, and left a staged scene marked by symbolic gestures. The recurring physical signatures are striking. In several of these crimes, investigators found lamps with chimneys removed or wicks bent low, a means of producing a dim, controlled glow rather than bright light. Mirrors and windows were frequently draped, and victims' faces were covered. The use of the pole of the axe rather than the blade appears repeatedly, suggesting either a practical preference or shared knowledge about an efficient way to kill without the blade lodging in bone. These commonalities point to a perpetrator with ritualized habits, not merely a violent opportunist. Ritual creates pattern, and pattern fuels the serial theory. Logistics reinforce the idea of a traveling offender. Early 20th century America had a dense web of railroads and a transient population of laborers, hobos, and itinerant workers who could arrive and depart towns without leaving strong paper trails. A killer moving by train could appear in one town, commit a murder using an axe found on the property, and then vanish the next night, leaving local investigators to puzzle over crimes that, at first glance, had nothing in common beyond their brutality. The use of a household axe as the murder instrument also fits this mobility. It removed the need to carry a conspicuous weapon and exploited a ubiquitous domestic tool. Yet the serial killer hypothesis has important limits. For one, similar modus operandi does not prove a single offender. Cultural and technological contexts can produce convergent behavior. Many homes had axes, many people smoked, and many households used lamps in comparable ways. Investigators prone to pattern seeking, especially under the pressure of sensational headlines, can conflate independent crimes into a single narrative. Additionally, evidence linking suspects across state lines was thin or non-existent. Travel records, eyewitness accounts, and forensic tins that modern detectives rely on were largely absent. Behavioral interpretation also complicates matters. Ritual-like scene staging can imply signature behavior, but it can also reflect local customs or idiosyncratic choices that coincidentally align. The presence of covered mirrors might indicate an offender's psychological need, or it might be a knee-jerk attempt to control light or privacy. Without clear forensic links, DNA, unique tool marks, or consistent personal items left by the perpetrator, the pattern remains suggestive rather than conclusive. In weighing the possibilities, the most defensible claim is cautious. Villisca fits a broader cluster of early 20th century axe murders with shared elements, making the serial theory plausible and worthy of serious consideration. It may represent one of America's earliest known examples of an itinerant killer operating across jurisdictions, but plausibility is not proof. The case underscores a historical truth about criminal investigation at the time. Limited science, fragmented records, and sensational reporting made it easy for patterns to be hypothesized and hard to test. In the end, the serial killer theory remains a compelling explanation for Villisca's horrors, one that opens useful investigative avenues but cannot, by itself, close the case. The more murders left Villisca a different town. In the days and weeks after June 10, 1912, ordinary rhythms shifted. Doors that had been left unlocked were bolted. Neighbors who once relied on casual trust began to watch one another, and the easy social intimacy of a small Midwestern community hardened into suspicion. The shock was not only the brutality of the crime but its intrusion into the most private of spaces, a home at rest, and that violation produced a sustained communal trauma. For many residents, daily life carried the afterimage of beds made for children, now empty and quiet. The Moore house itself became a live symbol of that trauma. Long after the trials and the headlines faded from the front pages, the white two-story on East 2nd Street drew attention, first from journalists and later from tourists and paranormal enthusiasts. By the mid to late 20th century, the story had curled into legend. Ghost hunters, history buffs, and curiosity seekers visited the property, and accounts of strange lights or footsteps fed the house's reputation. The phenomenon transformed Villisca's tragedy into a site of public spectacle, complicating the memory of the family with layers of folklore and commerce. The press played a central role in turning a local homicide into a national narrative. Sensational reporting amplified rumor, spotlighted suspects before evidence could be weighed, and helped produce a mythology around the case that often obscured nuance. Newspapers and later radio shows framed the killings as the work of a phantom villain, a narrative that was gripping but sometimes unhelpful to sober inquiry. That media pressure contributed, in part, to the rush of arrests, confessions, and trials that followed. Legal dramas fought not only in courtrooms but in the court of public opinion. In institutional terms, Villisca underscored the limits of early 20th century criminal investigation and helped prompt gradual changes. The contamination of the scene, the lack of standardized forensic procedures, and the difficulties of coordinating across jurisdictions highlighted weaknesses that reformers and later forensic pioneers sought to address. While the case itself did not produce immediate scientific breakthroughs, it joined a series of high-profile crimes that collectively nudged American law enforcement toward more systematic evidence handling and interagency cooperation. Today, the Villisca Axe Murders inhabit a complicated legacy, a cautionary tale about investigative fallibility, a historical marker of how communities process mass trauma, and a cultural touchstone for true crime storytelling. The unanswered questions remain a source of fascination and frustration, but the case's enduring lesson is clear. Violent acts can shatter private life and public trust alike, and the work of seeking truth often depends as much on patience and method as on outrage and rumor. Silence is the last thing that Villisca gave the Moore family, and silence is what stayed long after the courts closed. A century of investigation produced suspects, trials, confessions, and acquittals, but no final verdict. In practical terms, the record is a ledger of what was tried and what could not be proved. Inconsistent testimony, compromised evidence, and the limits of early forensic science left prosecutors with stories rather than proofs. Legally, the case closed without conviction. Historically, it remained open to interpretation. That open ending amplifies the case's human cost. For the neighbors who lived through the week that followed, and for the descendants who carried the name Moore, uncertainty became another wound. The lack of closure meant questions that multiplied rather than settled. Who had the motive strong enough? The skill and the opportunity to move so quietly through an ordinary home and leave such deliberate signs. Investigators and armchair sleuths have offered answers, each theory revealing more about its proponents than about the deed itself. The enduring echo of those theories is a reminder that facts, once muddied, invite narrative to fill the gaps. There is also a moral texture to the mystery. The scenes, staging the covered mirrors, the dimmed lamp, the pole of the axe used with chilling efficiency, suggests a perpetrator who cared as much about the aftermath as the killing. That care, paradoxically, makes the act less senseless and more frightening. It implies intent, practice, even a message. The killer walked away unseen but not forgotten. The memory of that ordered violence has lodged in public imagination precisely because it resists tidy resolution. If Villisca teaches anything to investigators and to the public, it is that process matters. The contamination of the scene and rush to judgment were as consequential as any suspect's alibi. Meticulous procedure, interjurisdictional coordination, and scientific patience are the tools that might have made a difference. Their absence left a hole that speculation rushed to fill. For modern listeners, the case is less a puzzle to be solved than a cautionary tale about how communities, media, and law enforcement respond under pressure. Thank you for watching SoulSpeak. If this story moved you, leave a comment below with your thoughts on who might have been responsible and why. Like the video if you found the episode compelling, and subscribe for more investigations into cases that refuse to be buried. Remember, evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes, it's closer than we think. That as the years pass, the house on East 2nd Street still stands quiet, unchanged, and heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. No one was ever convicted. The killer who walked away that night vanished into history, unseen, but never forgotten. Villisca remains both a mystery and a warning that, even in the safest places, darkness can find a way in. Thank you for listening to this story on Soulspeak. If this case intrigued you, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think was behind the Villisca Axe murders? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories that explore the shadows behind the headlines. And remember, evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes, it's closer than we think.